I don't know how it is for you, but when we have a week like the one we just had, sometimes I need to just break away from the normal news and watching the reporting. And it's I don't watch much of the news anymore anyway, but they're wonderful nature shows. And there's one on recently that I've kind of gotten hooked to, which is called this Aerial America. Have you seen it, Aerial America? No? Some say, yes, just nod with me, keep me going. That's all I need from you. So Aerial America, what they do is they go through the 50 states, and instead of kind of doing a documentary on a particular state, they do it from the air, Aerial America. And they do it with drone cameras and helicopters. And so the other day I flipped to Aerial America, and it was Aerial Florida. I'm like, okay, I'm a native Floridian. I like to watch this and get away from some of the things I'm seeing. So I'm watching Aerial Florida, and they pick particular spots along Florida, and they highlight these by flying over them, and they give you the bit of the history. Quite entertaining. I enjoyed it, and but they showed something that was that tweaked my curiosity, and also maybe was a bit of a history lesson. So I told the first service, I'm going to give you a small history lesson. There's no tuition. You get free credit for this education that's coming along right now for you. So here it is. Did you know in the summer of 2016, there was a particular excavation done in the state of Florida that established for the first time the exact site where the Spanish planted their earliest permanent settlement. Okay, this is the earliest settlement founded by Europeans in North America. So they discovered this thing, and it's amazing. In the inquiry, and they're showing on the documentary that at this particular site there were 1,500 people that originally landed there. Some were soldiers, some were just settlers, and they came along with Pedro Menendez. Remember that name from your history? Pedro Menendez. And they founded this Spanish colony. And you know the name of it, right? What is it? Orlando, right? No. St. Augustine, somebody got it right. It's St. Augustine. And the interesting thing about this is this first colony was decades before the English established the Virginia colony at Jamestown. We remember that from history. That was in 1607. Or the Mayflower Pilgrims. Remember those guys at Plymouth Rock? That was 1620. This is decades earlier than those landings. So if you want to know the exact spot, and they did the drone flew over and they showed a picture of the actual landing area. And if you've been to St. Augustine, you probably know what's coming next. There is a giant cross, and I think it's going to show up. There it is. There's a giant cross there right by the mission, the Catholic mission. But this is the area, you see the inlet, and they came up, and that's traditionally, they through artifacts they found, that's sort of the area in which that first landing occurred. And believe it or not, some say and suggest that not the Pilgrims that had the first Thanksgiving, but the first Thanksgiving was actually right here. And there's a picture of that. There were some folks with Menendez who landed, and they drew a sketch of the landing, and they had some of the Timucuan native folk were there, and they had this wonderful moment of thanksgiving to God for at that landing, and they invited the indigenous peoples. So next time you have to, I told somebody the first service, if you go to the history books, you're allowed to scribble out the Pilgrims' first Thanksgiving, because now you know really probably the first Thanksgiving was right there. At least St. Augustine claims that as the first Thanksgiving. Now, can you imagine 500 years ago when they stepped off that ship, what they saw? Because they didn't see what it looks like today. It looked very different. And as they began to explore inland, and others explorers came through Florida exploring inland and blazing those trails, what they saw in the Florida wilderness, kind of like that picture right there. They saw swamps and snakes and these things that look like dinosaurs called alligators, right? Alligators. It's amazing when people come to Florida and they're not used to experiencing and they see alligators, they get really excited. But so they're seeing all these this wilderness out there, and they're trying to make their way through it. And you can imagine they're making their way. And sometimes there were trails from the native peoples, but sometimes they're making their way through all of this flora and getting scratched and scraped and making their way through. And it was a bit of a wilderness journey. And even today, you might find this. If you go off trail sometimes through the wildernesses of Florida, it gives you a sense, a little bit of the experience of the difficulties of maybe that wilderness. I call it the wild wilderness of Florida of 500 years ago. Now, even today, although not exactly like Florida, and there aren't any alligators, there is a wilderness that still exists. It's the wilderness of the Dead Sea area. And it's a wilderness that is pretty much exactly the way it was 2,000 years ago when Jesus went on his own bit of an adventure into the wilderness, into areas that actually were no less dangerous than those Florida wildernesses that Menendez and his folks were struggling through. So I want you to follow along with me, if you will, in your Bibles. You can look at it's the Gospel of Mark. We'll be looking at verses 9 through 15. And this is the story of this adventure. So listen for the word of God. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and he was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens, and they're torn apart, and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Verse 12 says, "And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. And he was in that wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was with the wild beast, and the angels waited on him." May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. Now, this area that we're just talking about just now is known in Arabic as Qasr al-Yahud. It means the castle of the Jews. And there's a site right there about 5 miles north of the Dead Sea. I've actually been there. It's the same place. It's near Jericho. It's the approximate location that Joshua tells us the Israelites crossed the Jordan into the land of Canaan. And it's this area of the Dead Sea. I think I have a picture of it. So it's this area of the Dead Sea region. Now, there are some palm trees, and you see them, much like the Florida wilderness. And there's some water. But if you walk about 10 yards away from that Jordan, and I've been to that very spot in the Jordan. If you walk about 10 yards away from that, what you're going to find is a vast, vast rocky wilderness. Very dangerous. It was a place you could not survive very long, very little vegetation. And actually today it's extremely dangerous because there's landmines left over from the '67 war. So you have to be very careful. And if you go there, some of us that went to Israel noticed there were places where there were fences and warnings to not enter in because that wilderness was quite dangerous. It was not landmines, but it was quite dangerous for Jesus also when he heads out. So when I think about this wilderness journey of Jesus, he's headed out. He's just had this amazing experience in the Jordan River, and the Spirit falls on him, and it sounds wonderful. He hears the voice of God saying the kinds of things we wish God would say about us, right? That, oh, my beloved son, my beloved daughter, in whom I'm well pleased. Wonderful words. And it sounds to me like that's the time to head out and do ministry, right? He's feeling great. He's feeling wonderful. He's full of the Spirit. Let's go. It's kind of the rallying call. But Jesus doesn't do that at all. He goes from that very high moment out on a journey into the wilderness. So I start to wonder, why does he do that? Why does he go out pushing through the wilderness, spending 40 days in an area that provides almost no food, very little water? What was the purpose? And some would say, well, the purpose was a testing, right? He's being tested. Yes. Some people say temptation, that opportunity for temptation to come in. Yes. But those are the things that happened to him while he was on the journey. Why did he go? And I begin to wonder about this reading the passage and preparing for this Lenten sermon series that we're beginning today. I begin to wonder, why did he go? And it struck me that one of the reasons that he may have gone, along with the other things we talked about, is a way to identify with the human journey. What does that mean, identify with the human journey? Since creation, if we look back to the Genesis story and we're reading, Jody's reading about the bow in the sky, the covenant, God claiming us as his people and the protection over us, and never again would these things happen. It seems with that beauty of God's intentional creation, we've diverged off the path. We've gotten off, if I'm going to use this wilderness analogy that we started today, we've gotten off the main trail. We've entered into the wilderness. And the proof of that for me is, well, it's as close as last week. When we see senseless death, violence, it tells me humanity has moved off the track and has fallen into a wilderness. So I wonder, was Jesus just placing himself into our shoes? What it's like if he's truly coming in the person, if God comes to us in the person of Jesus Christ, experiencing our lives, would he not also experience our wilderness? If you think about it, after all, his life is just going from one wilderness to the other, ultimately the wilderness of the cross. So I wonder, in this little story about Jesus going off, it's 2 verses about going out into the wilderness and spending 40 days out there. Is there something for us to learn? We're on a journey too. We use these seasons as a way to grow more deeply in our spiritual life. So we're in the season of Lent. Is there something for us in this wilderness journey of Jesus, for us to see, for us to learn? And if so, how do we do that? How do we discover that, that treasure that's waiting there for us? I mentioned getting diverted off the path. I think sometimes we leave our lives unattended. And you go, oh, life's unattended. What does that mean? Again, get concrete. What does that mean? Life unattended to me means part of our lives can become hard. People can become numb. You heard that in Jody's prayer. The culture can numb us to some of these things that are around us. We can become self-centered. We can hurt folks with our words, and we know we can hurt them with our actions. We don't want to be left unattended in our lives. And the last thing I think we really want to do is step off that trail and try to run and force our way through some kind of wilderness journey. That's treacherous in its own way. But I want to suggest to you today that that's exactly what we do. We do wander off the path. We do wander off. We leave our spiritual lives somewhat unattended. We're at church, but there's more than this to our spiritual lives. There's something more to our physical lives. Why would we push through something that could hurt us and cause us to sting so badly? You know, I was growing okra last season, and it was wonderful. We'd never done it before, and I'd go out there and harvest the okra and cut it up. And I'm from the South, so there's only one way to really eat okra, and that's fry it, right? You guys that stew it, I don't know what you're doing there, but you cut it up and you fry it, and you dip it in some kind of sauce. That's how it works. So I planted my okra garden, and it went away when winter came. It died off, and I kind of left that garden alone for about 4 months. Well, Elise and I went out there last weekend and started clearing that garden. Let me tell you, in 4 months, the whole thing had grown over. There was all kinds of things growing up and roots, and I couldn't believe how long it took us to get in there and dig through that stuff. If you try to cut down, a little experiment, and how many of you have palmettos in your yard? Some of you? Okay. So if you go out and cut your palmetto off today, go back next week, and you know what you're going to find? It's right back, right? It doesn't take long to leave something unattended, and it will take over. We don't want to do that in our spiritual lives. That's what can happen. If you like, we leave our lives alone long enough and in certain ways, and it's like we find ourselves walking through a briar patch. And so I begin to wonder, for some of us, in some way, is it like we're walking through the briar patch of life? You know, Creedence Clearwater Revival had a song called Run Through the Jungle. Anybody remember that? Got to run through the jungle. I think the last thing we want to do, it's a great song. You don't want to run through the jungle. I don't want to run through those palms. They'll hurt you. You know, there are times when it does seem that way, though. I think we're battling, we're struggling. Maybe we're struggling, to use the analogy, like those early Florida explorers. We're trying to get through. Sometimes the path is quite dense. It's fraught with hazards. It has roadblocks in the way. And I think sometimes this journey we're on, even in our spiritual life, even for folks that come to church, it's like that. It's like we're still walking through that overgrown path where things sort of reach out and almost grab us and they tear at us like a saw palmetto. I still have the scars from weeding that garden from the saw palmettos. It's grabbing onto me and cutting. I think sooner or later, all of our journeys take us down a few of those paths. And we don't have to say it out loud. You can imagine what they are for you, where you've come from, where you are, where you're going. Where it seems like part of that life, it's just reaching out and it's grabbing you, and it's literally leaving some marks, even scars as a reminder of that wilderness jog through the jungle. So how do we get back? If the bow in the sky says, wow, God has something wonderful for us and wants to keep us safe, and never again will flesh be destroyed like that. If we want to get back to the original blueprint of God's plan for our lives, how do we do that? Is there a path? Is there a path in this wilderness? And if there is a path in this wilderness, how do we know how to find it? And what will it be like? Are there any clues? I'm looking out, so most of you are here today, and every now and then we have folks visiting from out of town, but most of you, I'm guessing, today live in Florida at least part of the time, right? You know what we call briar patches in Florida, don't you? If you don't, I'm going to tell you today. A briar patch in Florida goes by the name of a clump of saw palmettos, and if you don't doubt me, just try moving through them. It's a briar patch. They will tear you up, right? Anyone walking through a path, even sometimes if you just innocently brush a saw palmetto, if you hit it just right, and even this palm here has some of these pricklies on it that'll get you, it'll grab hold. It'll sting. It'll cut. And sometimes it leaves marks, right? Florida palm trees, they have a particular name, and Jerry talked about it today. This is a great little palm shoot cut out here. So our state, now you know our state tree is cabbage palm. Not the date palm, cabbage palm. Although somebody corrected me this morning, they came to the first service and they said, by the way, do you know a palm is not a tree, it's a grass? Well, I'm not rewriting the sermon, so it's a palm tree today, I'm telling you. It's a palm tree. So, if you visited Florida, if you live here, you know, if we have a nuclear holocaust, if we have a super volcano that erupts in Orlando, do you know there are two things that are going to survive? The saw palmetto and the palmetto bug, also known as the giant Florida cockroach. People come to Florida from up north and they're, what is that? What is that bug? It's a palmetto bug. But they live. I told you, just try to kill either one of them. They're like immortal. It's very hard to take care of. However, that's not what put the palmetto on par with the mosquito that seems to bug Floridians too. It's that shin lashing, arm scratching effect that I talked about of the palmetto branch. It's not called the saw palmetto for nothing. So if you've ever blazed a trail in Florida, maybe you're thinned out your backyard the way Elisa and I did, you know this, the saw palmetto is bound to leave its mark, as I said. And you may even have one of these, I don't know, I call them palmetto Purple Hearts. You know, it's like that participation award. It says you actually got out there and did battle with the palmetto, and it leaves these kind of purple ribbon marks on your arms. I've got them. I can't show you. They're underneath my robe right now. They're beautiful plants, but they're also treacherous. And that's because nature has a way of protecting its treasures. Think about this now. If you can get past the natural defenses, there's often a very sweet reward. And Jerry alluded to that in the children's message. So I want you to follow along with me. To get to get to honey, what do you have to go through? I gave you the answer. To get to honey, what do you have to go through? Bees. To get to corn, what do you have to go through? Husks, right. To get to sugar, what do you have to go through? The cane. To get to a rose, what do you have to go through? The thorns. I'm going to suggest to you, if you like, this is one way to walk through the 40 days of Lent. There is something at the center of the palm. Jerry alluded to it, the heart of palm. I actually have some here. But there's something else. You say, what good can come out of a palm tree? Sometimes sweetness lays hidden below the surface. I actually found this last week. I was at a nursery. This is palmetto honey. Who knew? Somebody knew because they make it, palmetto honey. So there you go. Lent is not a time to fight through the wilderness, to tear through that overgrown portion, those sacred areas of our lives. But I'm going to suggest to you for this Lent, it's a time to slowly make our way together, observing the briars, right? The thorns, the ones we've walked through, as I said, the ones that might be before us right now, the ones up ahead. Because God didn't design us to run through the jungle of life in a way that tears and pulls at us. Think about this as we get to the end here. Imagine Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Do you know they didn't have any protective clothing, did they? It says they were naked. You ever think about that? In the original Garden of Eden relationship with God, Adam and Eve don't have protective clothing. It was only after they chose to pull away from God and go their own way and go fight through the jungle of life did they need protection, protective clothing. Like nature, behind our defenses, there's often a treasure waiting if you know where to look. And that's what I want to invite you to do if you'll hang out with us for the next few weeks as we start to look a little deeper. You might say, can anything good come out of a saw palmetto? You know? Well, yes, it can. We know. There's two things right now, honey and the heart of palm, if you know how to find it. Since we all live, at least for a portion, in Central Florida, it seems fitting that this season of Lent, that we take a few lessons from this grass, this tree, this bush, this palmetto. And I think if you stay with us long enough, you may be surprised at how closely this native plant reveals something about the human heart in all of us. For example, just a little forecast. The palm leaves provide shade. That has some consequences. Those branches have thorns, which cut and scratch. The trunk of the palm has this very interesting webbing on it, which makes it an impenetrable layer. That has consequences also. And finally, if we work through all those defenses, the reward is the heart of the palm. Anyone can reach it. Anyone in this room can reach it. You only need to know the sacred heart of palm reading. Amen.